Hello and welcome to the People Space Podcast with me, Wenson Mavori. Now, today is quite an interesting day because I am privileged to be featuring an individual that comes from an interesting nation of South Africa. And when I say interesting, you know what I mean with regards what is going on with the state funeral. But anyway, that is not the focus of this podcast. As my guest, Thandolwenthu Lukuko, all the way from South Africa, will be joining me. And of course, we'll be talking about the important subject of fossil fuel and the impact that these resources have not only on the environment but generally on the economy, but further extending the conversation on, is it possible to be able to strike a balance between ensuring that there is sustainability vis-a-vis pursuing of economic development, especially for nations that are dependent on these natural resources. Now, for those that may not know, or for those that will be meeting this gentleman for the very first time, Thandolwenthu Lukuko is a Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative Africa political advisor at Afrodad. And of course, we will be delving into this important subject. So, Thando, it's great to have you.
Thank you, Vincent. Great to be here.
Thanks for joining us on the People Space Podcast. And as you may be aware, before we get into the nitty-gritties of our conversation, I'd like to just remind each and every one of you that you are at liberty to be able to stand a chance to win yourself some amazing and fantastic prizes, ranging, of course, from mug cups, t-shirts, capes, interesting memorabilia that you can use as souvenirs. But all you simply have to do is get interactives on the platforms where we broadcast the episodes of the People's Space Podcast. That is Facebook under the handle the Center for Trade Policy and Development, and YouTube. On TikTok, Twitter, and other social media platforms, it is CTPD Zambia. So if your comment garners enough reactions or traction, you do stand a chance to win those amazing and fantastic prizes. All right. So we get on into the conversation today. We are obviously talking about something very, very important, fossil fuels. An important element. We can't discuss development. We can't talk about, obviously, the economy, even on a global scale, without looking at the role that fossil fuels play. And before we get into our conversation, Thando, for the sake of this conversation, yes, obviously, I'll be calling you Thando. I mean, you still owe us the body. So I won't mind going into the details of Thandolwenthu. I'll just say Thando. So please, at the time when this will be airing, just know that Thando hasn't given us back the body yet. Yeah, but anyway, like I said, I'm just joking. He's not responsible, please. Yeah. So Thando, we have a tradition on the People's Space Podcast where we obviously want to first of all know who is Thando behind the work that you do at Afrodad, which obviously has to do with the issue of policy, advocacy, and debt, and all these important economic issues that you deal with at Afrodad. Who is Thandolwenthu?
Thank you for the question. I'll give you the short version, right? Because the longer version would need another episode for.
Interesting.
No, in short, so at the moment I've got several caps. One of the caps is working together with Afrodad. The cap that brings me to Zambia today is Africa political advisor for an initiative called Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. So really that work takes me through different African states where we discuss what the treaty is. I think we'll talk a little bit about it later. But before that, I did some work. I used to run the South African chapter for Climate Action Network. I used to run the Southern African chapter of Climate Action Network as well. I've been in the development space now just over 10 years. Before that, I did some entrepreneurship stuff of my own. So hence I say, okay, I'll give you the Crypt Nose version. Otherwise, we'll sit here for a little while.
Okay, typical of... most Africans, that entrepreneurial spirit is just,
it's strong.
Half the time, it's just in us, irrespective of what you do or the profession that you're very much into. But there's always that aspect and element that just draws you to entrepreneurship. But anyway, we will obviously at some point maybe delve into that. But for the purposes of our conversation, as we get started, we like to simplify things here and make people understand, when we talk about fossil fuel, obviously, to some people, it may look like it's a huge terminology, for people like Thando that talk to important people or presidents and whoever, just help us understand what fossil fuels are, even as we lay the foundation for our conversation.
All right. So if we look at it from, let's say, very basic high school level, it's fossil fuels, resources that had died many years back, right? Pushed into the ground and then fossilized and then became what was a rock, then became a liquid form. So typically it might form oil, it might form gas, and it might form coal, right? Those are the three primary sources of fossil fuels. And the other term for it is hydrocarbons. But what's characteristic about all of them is that they typically burn fairly easily, and you can burn them for a really long time, and they give you quite a lot of utility or usage, right? So you can use it from things like driving your vehicles to heating your home to providing the electricity that we use through power stations, right? So they really come in three forms, but essentially it's fossilized natural material over years that we can then unearth through typically mining or drilling, and then we then use it for whatever economic value that we have, or that we want to use it for, whether in this country or any other country. But it's really the major driving force behind the global economy, certainly, most African economies as well, and essentially even at a household level, because even if you're using things like paraffin, you're using fossil fuels, even if you're burning firewood, in a sense, you might be a more immediate source of fuel, but essentially it's the coal and charcoal and the likes, yes. So it's really to heat up and burn.
Okay.
Yeah.
Obviously, we know that fossil fuels play an integral role when it comes to economic development.
Yeah.
And when we talk about one of the, I like to refer to it as what others have called it, like the emerging tourist capital of the world, Dubai.
Yes.
Everybody wants to go there.
Yeah.
But when you unearth the story of Dubai, obviously fossil fuels have played an integral role
Yes.
in developing that economy to assuming that status. If you talk about countries like South Africa, Zambia, Nigeria, all these economies that you can think of, fossil fuels has historically played and continues to play an integral role.
100%.
But at what cost? One would want to know.
Let's look at the question of cost in three ways, right? We could look at it from an environmental cost. We can look at it from a social cost, so societal cost. And then we could look at it obviously in terms of economics, right? So money. If you look at it from an environmental cost, like I was saying earlier, if we look at the process of mining for coal or drilling for oil, it has a very direct environmental cost, right? Because you destroy the soil, the rocks, to be able to get to the thing that you want, which is the fossil fuels, whatever it is. So there's that cost, because once you open a mine, you don't typically close it, right? It just stays in its bare open state. So there's the environmental cost. Added to that then is when you burn it, it's like if you're at home and you're making a fire out of wood. If you burn the fire, like in this room, for instance, it's going to fill up with smoke. If you do that for long enough, we're all going to choke. So if you look at it, that kind of concept on a global scale with power stations and the like, if we're putting out enough smoke into the atmosphere, at some point the room is going to get full, right? And it's going to start to affect weather. And so that's one of the environmental challenges. So when you see extreme weather events, a major driver for those events is fossil fuels. And particularly, it's getting too hot for the earth to be able to cool itself. And it's because of this blanket of smoke, if you will. So that's the environmental cost. The social cost is, following on that same example, if you take people who live in mining communities, typically, they may struggle from things like irritated skin, irritated eyes. It might affect their lungs because they can't breathe properly, right? And so typically a government would then have to provide the medical services to try and help get that person better, right? And that carries with it an economic cost. And so that's when the economics comes in as well, is it's expensive to drill and get the oil out of the ground. It's expensive to process it. It's expensive to transport it. It's expensive to put it from the petrol pump into your vehicle, right? And so there's all these different types of costs that one has to factor in when you're making the decision as a country as to whether or not we want to use this particular source to power our economy. But the beauty of it, in inverted commas, is that the economics of it used to make a lot more sense than they do today, because the return on that investment used to be very, very good. Nowadays, it's just good, but quickly those returns are diminishing and it's becoming less good to invest in fossil fuels.
One of the interesting things that obviously comes to mind when we have an interesting conversation such as this one, Tando, is it really possible, because I'm looking at it from an advocacy point of view. You have on this side of the spectrum, advocacy that says this is okay, this is good. Look, we've built schools, hospitals, we've built economies, we've created jobs, we've reduced poverty, which ultimately is the goal of every human being on earth, to live above the poverty line.
Correct. Yeah.
On the other side of the spectrum, there's again correct advocacy that tries to raise awareness on some of the implications that you've highlighted.
Yes.
Is it then possible to have a balance when it comes to pursuing economic development that is driven by fossil fuels? Is it possible to really strike a balance? Can you have this cake and eat it at the same time?
Eat it at the same time. And I think that's the question that we're all trying to grapple with, honestly speaking. Right? I want to say yes, but the logic in me and the educated part, based on what I know, says no. Right? So if you look at the yes part, it's yes because there's a concept called an energy mix, right? And it follows a similar concept to like a kind of diversified portfolio as you would have in financial terms, right? So you'd say you've got different ways of generating your electricity, right? And the best way to hedge yourself is to not be dependent on a single source, right? And so for as long as you could try to provide multiple sources of being able to generate your electricity, in theory, it should be able to help you weather a storm and then give you the development that you're seeking, right? So it should. But on the other hand, it's like, no, you can't. Because once you use, for example, coal, I mean, this country is starting to use coal a lot more. Once you start to use coal and you start to get the returns from coal, you start to realize that actually coal might be a little bit cheaper to get out of the ground and then use. So maybe if, we use more of this cheaper source, we could get higher returns, and then those higher returns might be able to make us build more roads, build more schools, and so on. But in so doing, you destroy more of your environment, you destroy more of your atmosphere, because coal is dirty when you burn it. So part of the goal that we do, certainly within the global economy, is try to figure out what that balance is, and how most specifically we can then use energy sources that don't necessarily pollute quite as much. But the ultimate aim, no matter what the source is, as you said, is to make sure people have got access, right? And you're above the poverty line, so you can make money for yourself to feed yourself, keep yourself warm, etc. How you get there is the tricky part. But certainly there is a balance that can be found somehow. It's just the other thing that makes the balancing part tricky is that, look at, again, Zambia. Zambia is predominantly hydropowered. They've got reserves of coal. But if they wanted more coal, they would probably have to import that coal from somewhere. Right? So a country like SA, for example. So these are the factors that one has to take into cognizance as well. How much of it can we realistically use that's within the country? And how much of it can we then bring in from outside? And obviously it carries costs with it. So yes and no. Okay. Maybe I would get into less trouble if I say no.
Interesting. So, in the same vein, if you look at African economies, obviously was so dependent on, extractives.
Yeah.
So much dependent on extractives. But sometimes I feel like our dependence has never really, or we've never really experienced so much pressure that we're at the point where we've seen the need to invest, say, in technology that would help us achieve the balance, that would help us to be able to start producing green, sustainable, development. And is it really possible? I mean, as African countries, are we really doing enough to be able to see to it that, in as much as we know that our bread and butter is mining, but at the same time, we start looking at seriously investing both at policy and even at, technology, machinery level, to make sure that sustainable development becomes a
Achievable.
reality.
Yeah.
Because there are nice policy documents that I hear, Uncle Ramaphosa will be talking about sustainable development,
Yeah.
green and clean South Africa.
Yeah.
And it's the same story here in Zambia.
Yeah.
So as African countries, where are we? Do you think we're doing okay when it comes to at least making sure that, in as much as we're dependent on the extractive sector, we're also making strides in this other area?
I think as an African, I can be very harsh and critical on this one.
That's the whole purpose
Right.
of the People Space podcast.
All right.
You won't get in trouble. You've got the immunity. You've got the immunity.
Okay, I'll take it. All right. So, no, we're not. We're not. Let's take a few examples. We'll take some good examples and some not so good examples.
Okay.
Maybe two of each if I can find a second for the latter. Bad examples. DRC, Nigeria. All right. DRC is probably the single largest country with mining activity happening because they've got, as an individual country, the single largest mineral deposits. Right? I don't know if you've been to DRC. Nah?
No, not really.
Yeah.
Not really.
For
the context of this conversation, not
No,
really.
not really.
But
Okay.
but in different contexts, I've been there.
I follow.
yeah.
All right. So look, for the purpose of the conversation, you would think that for all of the minerals that DRC has, right, and the wealth that those minerals amount to, and how much of it has been extracted, that they would be further along the development curve than they are. Right. Similarly, when you look at a country like Nigeria has had oil for a really long time, and they've been extracting oil for a really long time, but they haven't been able to totally turn the. Okay, let's put it this way as a nice juxtaposition. You mentioned Dubai. Do you know that Dubai existed as a desert in 1989? It was a desert in 1989, right? The Dubai that you know today,
It's like 36 years ago.
exactly, right? And I can tell you that Nigeria has been taking oil out of the ground for longer than that. But when you think of Nigeria, you don't want to take your money there and go shopping and like buy all the latest jewels and diamonds and all that stuff, right? You go there for other reasons, right? When you look at just what the country looks like, there's beautiful parts of Nigeria, but there's other parts of Nigeria where you ask yourself, but guys, what are you guys doing with all the money? You know what I mean? Road infrastructure, for example. I spent a month in Nigeria, so I know what it looks like. Bad examples, right? Then you take better examples. South Africa is one of the better examples. It's not the best, but it's one of the better ones. They've also got a significant amount of mineral resources, but they were able to turn it into a very solid road network, very solid infrastructure, right? Another country maybe that has done similarly well. See, like I was saying, I'm hard pressed to find another one. But if you look up north, countries like Egypt have done quite well. Countries like Algeria have done quite well. These are not African states, right, with electrification. But typically, it doesn't quite equate. So there's a huge gap between countries with very extensive mineral deposits, particularly fossil fuels, that can ring fence a lot of that money, but are not turning it into the kind of city that you would see when you look at a place like Dubai, when you look at a place like Singapore. Singapore has no minerals, but yet they're a first world nation, right? So there's a very long road that we still need to go as African countries. And part of it is, in what I was saying today, is we need to figure out what is it exactly that we want. Because in a place,
like that.
you know what I mean? What is it that you want?
What is
Because
it that we want?
once you figure that out,
Yeah.
you know what you don't want. And you know what's going to take you there. You also know what's not going to take you there. And for me, it's that question. I don't think we know what we want. I mean,
Unfortunately, if somebody expected me to differ with you, I can't, because you see, I was telling somebody right next door here, before we get on a break.
Yeah.
Just next door here, Angola has oil.
Yes.
Okay. But Zambia has to buy oil from the Gulf countries. Yet Angola has got oil
right next door.
right next door here.
You guys share a border, and you have to go
Exactly.
out of the
You
continent.
can literally, there are people that even walk into Angola when you go to the western part of this country. They walk into Angola. Okay? There are certain people who've got two homes. One is in Angola, the other
One
is
is
in
here.
Zambia. So like really, I feel as African nations, until we get to a place that you've rightly said, where we define exactly what we want, have the patience, and begin to think beyond political cycles
Yes.
in drafting policies that can give us what we need. Only then can we begin to say, okay, I think this is it. But anyway, we will continue talking about more of that after we return from a break. But remember, as I mentioned earlier on, you can win yourself some amazing prizes ranging from t-shirt, mug cups, fantastic memorabilia, that we are offering as the People's Space podcast. All you simply have to do is get interactive on our social media platforms where these episodes are broadcast. That is Facebook, YouTube, under the handle, the Center for Trade Policy and Development. On TikTok, on Twitter, and other platforms, it is CTPD Zambia. If your comment garners enough traction, you could be that lucky winner. And one of the things that we do, by the way, is when we have experts like Tando, the one that I'm conversing with in the country, say for longer, we could create an opportunity for you to have an interaction, a face-to-face interaction with them, learn from them some of the things that you would wish to learn. But remember, all that opportunity and more can only be accessed if you get interactive with us on those social media platforms. And most importantly, let's click that like button. We'll be back after the break. Welcome back to People's Space Podcast with me, Wenton Mavora. My guest today is Thandolwenthu. I hope
You got it right. Lukuko.
Lukuko. I almost said Lukaku. Lukuko Thandolwenthu. All the way from South Africa. He is currently serving at the African Forum and Network on Debt and Development, and some of you may know that as AfroDebt. Of course, it's an organization that is quite known for those that operate within the fiscal space, and generally, when we talk about just fiscal governance on the African continent, playing a crucial role. And we are today looking at fossil fuels, and of course, looking at their impact not only from the environmental perspective, which obviously is common in conversations, but taking the conversations a little bit broader and looking at other aspects as well. Tando, as we continue our engagement, one of the things that I would like us to, delve into a little bit is what has been gaining traction recently or in the recent past, the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. A lot of people have described it as a game changer. And for me, if I hear words like game changer, these are words that I've heard a lot, but when I look at the playbook, it still remains the same. The game still remains the game, but people say game changer. So why are people saying this particular treaty is a game changer when it comes to climate governance that should be the concern of everybody, even as we pursue development?
Okay. I'll try to respond to you in 3 points. The first one is around the idea of non-proliferation. If you remember, there was a point in time where there was no legal framework that governed how nuclear and nuclear weapons was being managed in the world, right? So if you had uranium and you had the skills, you could just develop a nuclear capability. And then at some point, countries decided to come to the table and then put together what's called the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And that really managed how countries can obtain nuclear material and use nuclear material, right? So one of the elements that makes then Fossil Fuel Treaty a game changer is that having recognized the role that fossil fuel plays in climate change and climate disasters, right? Because of that burning element, we need to get to a point where we recognize that we cannot keep doing this ad nauseum, right? We need to change how it is that we generate our electricity and energy. And we haven't been able to do that with a non-legally binding agreement, right? So the Paris Agreement, in the context of the Conference of the Parties and so on, tries to certainly create a global response to climate change. But fossil fuels as the primary cause of climate disasters and climate change, right, only showed up in the 30 plus years of COP, only showed up for the first time in the formal paperwork in Egypt, which was 2022, 23, if I'm not mistaken, right? And so in recognition over the years that we've been going through these negotiations, we've been trying to discuss how we want to respond to it, but the single largest cause being fossil fuels isn't being adequately addressed. Perhaps what we need to do then is to put in place a legally binding agreement that says you can no longer use this particular source, right? So that's the first element. The second element then is the one that speaks to this idea called equity. If we again use the African example, right, you've got countries that are varied across the spectrum. If you use some of the terminology, there's what's called least developed countries. Those are countries like Malawi, which might not have significant resources, financial and otherwise, of their own. So they may not be able to address climate change in the way that it needs to be addressed. One example of this is if a cyclone comes through and then all of our equipment here gets washed out, who's going to pay for the replacement of that? Do we have enough money amongst us here to be able to replace it? Typically, no. So that's the general idea behind what we call least developed, right? And it's the ability to be able to weather the storm, so to speak, out of their own resources. And that's compared to what's called your developed and developing countries. So South Africa is an example of a developing country. It's not necessarily wealthy in the sense of G7 countries or like the wealthiest nations, but certainly on the continent, it is one of the wealthier nations. And so even though they might be able to buy one or two cameras, they can only afford maybe one or two, not all three, right? Or some equipment, not everything. So the idea behind equity is to say, we need to recognize that not all of us would be able to respond in the same way. So how can we respond respective to what our pocket allows us to? That's the second component. And then the third component is this idea of justice and this idea of what's called a just transition. And that is, there have been people who have been on the receiving end of injustices in the world, right? Of many kinds. Even when you look at something like electricity, some people might not have it, right? Some people use electricity, other people use firewood. That's just the reality. So what we're trying to then do is to say, well, how do we make sure that those who were using firewood previously move to a world where they've also now got formal electricity? So those three pieces make it really unique in that it's a legally binding piece which tries to create some kind of equity in the world that also then tries to redress a lot of the injustices of the past. So I would say it's those three pieces that make it really the game changer. But I must also say that we're at that kind of conceptualize or beyond conceptualization phase. We're now needing to get into who can sit at the table and start to negotiate around what this legal instrument must look like. And there's been a little bit of momentum that's been gathered in different parts of the world. On the continent, there's two major countries which have signed on: Sierra Leone, Freetown, and I think it's Lilongwe in Malawi. That's part of the reason that we're working in Zambia, is so that we can get Zambia as a country to be the third on that list, so that we can really now get to understand from an African perspective, what is it that would be needed to respond to those three things? And how do we ensure that we don't repeat what has happened in the past, and that we don't just become the breadbasket of the world and benefit nothing in so doing?
I will shortly get back to the first point that you mentioned, the first pillar that you mentioned about, putting in an agreement or a law that just limits, if not restricts, the use of this particular resource at the peril of the environment.
Yes.
Does the treaty speak to the realities of most of these, global South countries, including those that are being identified as emerging global South countries that you and I agreed earlier on are reliant on extractive industries? And one of the problems that these countries, or let me just be blunt, let me not say these countries, let me say Zambia.
Okay.
Because I'm in Zambia, I'm Zambian. One of the things that as a country we're good at is subscribing to these international treaties that are very good that can help us, but domesticating these treaties
Yeah.
for us to actually begin to see tangible results is where usually the gap is.
Yeah.
So two things: does the treaty speak the realities in the global South countries that are dependent on extractives, and how is the pace in terms of domesticating the treaty?
So it's important to say that the actual treaty itself doesn't yet exist. Right. So there's no your president is not going to be asked to sign anything. Right. And certainly there's no need to domesticate anything yet. Where the conversation currently stands is, and it kind of comes back to now to your first question, is if Zambia as a country is saying that this thing is not responsive to our needs, I would ask, well, what are your needs, and how would you, if the world was yours to lead, right? What would you want in there that would satisfy you, where you can then tell me after that process that I'm happy with this process. It is reflective of what is happening in my country. I can see myself in this treaty, and therefore I can apply myself in so doing. The short answer is we're not yet there. What I would love to do is for us to sit around the table and figure out that exact answer, right? Because that answer, or rather that question, is just as applicable to other African states as it is to Zambia, right? And so this really becomes the tricky thing about the treaty. So it's to bring countries to the table to discuss that specific piece. What does it look like for you? What do you want to see in it, so that it speaks to your country priorities, it speaks to your people, but also responds to the international circumstance and positioning that we find ourselves in.
So remember, I'd said I'll get back to your earlier point when we talk
Yes.
about a treaty that sort of regulates how we could, or that regulates the uptake of fossil fuels with a view to develop economies.
Yeah.
There's this argument, for lack of a better term, in my view, I feel like it's not really. I feel like it lacks perspective, like a holistic picture.
Okay.
But there are people who have said, look, today the United States of America will tell us don't use coal, but
Yes.
coal is what coal, natural gas is what they've used to build their economy to where they are today.
100%.
China will come and tell you, no, you can't use coal, but coal has fueled the
Yes.
Chinese economy to making it the second, arguably even the first, the biggest economy in the world. There's this school of thought. So I just wanted to pick your mind on it. I'm not putting you on the spot, but are these people right who will come and say, well, why should they be telling us to stop using what Belt developed them, gave them the capital, gave them the resources that they have to even respond to the environmental challenges that, extracting these resources may impose on them?
Yeah. Look, I've heard that school of thought. And once upon a time, I subscribed to it myself. I won't lie. And the thing is, it's got a solid basis in truth. I mean, look at it, right? Look at China. Look what China's been able to do, similar to these other two countries I mentioned, Dubai and Singapore. China similarly, right? In a very short space of time. Fine, it's been a country that's been around for thousands of years, but in terms of where it is today, it's really gotten to grow in the last maybe 3 decades or so, right? And a big part of that is as a result of fossil fuels. And so I cannot deny that reality, right? The same way though, I cannot deny now the reality that one of the major drivers of, if not the major driver of climate change, is for the burning of fossil fuels, carbon dioxide particularly, right? So, and for us to have gotten to this place, it's because of these economies and the extent to which they burnt fossil fuels and used fossil fuels for us to be where we are today. The cyclones that we're experiencing in different parts of the continent, right, especially in your Mozambique, Malawi and Zimbabwe, that particular corner, is highly prone to extreme weather events. Every other year, if not every year, something's happening there. Now, that is because of the weather patterns that are changing, right? And they're changing for the most part because of climate change, because of the burning of fossil fuels, right? So if we now want to follow that same path, where is it going to land us, right? And also, where do we want to land or position ourselves in a global community that is moving away from that particular source? Because part of the thing that we don't do well enough, in my view, as African states generally, is to say, how can we depend on ourselves for our survival? You know what I mean? Like, if you look at any country, probably one of two or maybe three economies are biggest trading partners. It's either China or US or it's Europe. Those are the three biggest trading partners of any country in this continent, right? So those economies are moving away. There's something called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM for short, that basically says if you are bringing in materials into Europe that are made out of high carbon intensive or come from a high carbon intensive process, there's a tax that you're going to have to pay to bring those goods into this continent, right? And you will have to bear that cost as the person bringing these goods in. Which means a country like South Africa, for example, which has got what's called PGMs or platinum group minerals, which are necessary for things like catalytic converters, and some of your renewable energy materials are needed. They need those minerals. If they come from a process where we've used coal to be able to refine this thing and make this thing, it's going to have a high carbon value to it. That high carbon value we're going to have to pay the tax for when we import it into Europe. Which means it's either we're no longer going to import into Europe because we can't afford to, or we're going to have to change the way in which we generate some of these things so that we can import into Europe.
Market,
You know what I mean? So this is where the world is. So it kind of goes back to that question of, well, where exactly do we want to be as a continent? We could say that what we want is to burn as much oil and gas and coal as we can, but we're only going to trade amongst ourselves and not have to worry about paying these taxes to other continents. But can we do that? We're not doing it now. We could do it today, but we're not doing it. So can we do it? Do we want to do that? We don't know. So the question then comes back to, well, you want to build your economy, you want to build schools, you want to build roads. You can't do it at the same level of carbon intensity as previous economies have. So how are you going to do it? You either bite the bullet and find the least carbon intensive way to be able to do it, or you say, let's forego this whole carbon thing. We're going to go gung-ho on fossil fuels and we're only going to trade amongst ourselves. But again, if you look at then the social and environmental impact of that, what does it mean for your atmosphere? I don't know if you've seen pictures of India recently, different parts of India, the smog that's there. I'm sure many of us at some point in our schooling careers would have seen the pictures of China, how people used to walk around with the masks and stuff, that smog. That is very likely what we would have to accept as a way of life for us if we want to use fossil fuels, right? Because China's got the economy, for sure. But what is the state of their environment? You know what I mean? And are you going to be making good enough returns to make it comfortable enough to live in such an environment? We don't know.
Yeah.
So this is where the real quagmire of our positioning comes in.
One of the things that has been gaining prominence on the subject of fossil fuels obviously has to do with the cost of transition.
Yes.
And the question still remains, who pays the cost?
Yes.
Countries like Zambia obviously are making strides. We've realized the need to be able to start transitioning. We have, established the Ministry of Green Economy and Environment as a progressive, effort.
Yeah.
But really, who pays the cost for transition? And are we capable? How do we get through this process?
Another interesting question. You've got a lot of interesting questions so far. I'm really enjoying this. So look, there's a principle called polluter pays, right? And as the name suggests, if you caused it, you pay for it, right? Remember when we were growing up, there was that the one who smelt it dealt it, the one, yeah. It's a similar thing, right? So you caused the problem, you pay for the problem that you caused. Now, in theory and in principle, it makes sound logic. It's a little bit difficult to make it happen in real terms. Why? Because let's look at it from an investment perspective. And maybe let me play devil's advocate a little bit. Let's say we start a company, and in this company, we want to export coal want to import coal, sorry, from Angola into Zambia, right? But in so doing, there's the environmental destruction that happens from getting the coal out of the ground. There's the road network that's going to be destroyed because our trucks are going to be moving all the time. And then there's the impact on the sides of the road because sometimes the stuff falls over and kind of, makes it messy. Now, if we are the ones who are, and we did that in an environment where that damage didn't exist, right? We are the ones who would, in theory, under the polluter pays principle, would have to pay for that. But for us to move our coal from Angola to Zambia, the Zambian government would give us a very favorable term, right? They would allow us to have tax concessions. They would allow us to have set up a facility close to either the city or close to the border so that we can, operate as efficiently and as effectively as possible, so that they can generate sufficient enough investment incentive for us to invest in that business here. Now, the challenge then comes in to say, well, if now the polluter pays, and you and I are the polluter, and you and I are the ones invested here, how much are you going to want to pay before it starts to really eat into our profits? That's the trickiness. And that's the balancing act that we try to play with many government actors, is it, in theory, the ones who cause the damage should pay for it. But it comes against the interest of the country to want to develop and how it wants to develop and some of the things that it's put in place to allow for the development to happen that might counter the intentions of what the polluter pays principle might want to achieve. So it's tricky. So I'm not here to say that all of these things are simple. I mean, as you can hear, they're rather complex, right? But we need to get to a point where we're saying, look, you and I are creative and young enough to be able to come up with a solid idea of how to satisfy both of those things. And this is the point that we need to get to. And again, to kind of judge my continent, it's not happening enough because all of the smartest people are living in other continents, don't want to come back here. And the ones that remain are the ones that, either want to get involved with the stuff or don't want to get involved in the stuff. And so what happens? So this is like the trickiness of the position we find ourselves in.
Thando, unfortunately, we have to come to the end of our conversation.
Oh my goodness.
Before
So
I get
quickly.
in trouble, imagine.
So quickly.
Imagine. But before I get in trouble, obviously, what would be your last message to the policymakers that will have an opportunity to watch this particular episode of the People Space podcast where we are looking at fossil fuels? What would be your word of advice or your final message to them?
We're at the precipice of a massive, massive, massive world change, right? We're about, in fact, we've actually entered a new dispensation around how things like electricity and energy are generated, right? The question that we need to grapple with is, again, where do we want to be when it comes to that? Because where we want to be will determine the actions that we take. And part of the actions that would take require policy interventions that would need to be enacted by those who are responsible for setting up policy. So if they're in a position to help us be very clear on where we want to be as a society, then we can all get together on this boat so that we know what decisions to make in order to get us to the promised land, as it were. The final thing I'll say is just to make a bit of a juxtaposition once again to times past. If you look at the period between 1960 till 1994, that 50 years is when pretty much all of the African states gained independence. But to get to that point, all 50, maybe 2 states at the time, had to agree that this is what we wanted. And they all moved in that direction. Hence, from 1960, African states gained independence in like tumbling. You know what I mean? Started with Ghana, and then very quickly others followed. And so it's that level of decision, that level of thinking foresight that we need to find ourselves in today, because the world is looking at what's called a 2050 time horizon, 2050 to the end of the century, so 2100. That's not far. It's between 25 and 75 years from today. That's not far. It might sound like it, but it's not. And we need to figure out what is it that we want in that time frame, because once we miss the boat, we're going to be locked into this way of life that we understand it today for I don't know how long. So we need to figure out what we want.
Thando, thank you very much for coming through to the People Space podcast.
Thank you so much, Vincent, for having me. It's been a very, very interesting and wonderful conversation.
Okay.
I hope to be back.
Definitely. I mean, we will make time. And please, you can pass the message to everybody else at Afro that you guys are welcome to come here. And you never know, sponsor some episodes, you know what I mean?
We'll definitely talk about it.
All right, so that, ladies and gentlemen, brings us to the end of this special episode of the People Space podcast, where we were looking at fossil fuels, and at the same time analyzing the Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, looking at the fact that, or rather interrogating if at all it speaks to the realities in countries like Zambia and other jurisdictions that particularly still depend on fossil fuels to be able to charter the course of their economic trajectory. And giving us perspectives is Thando, who is coming all the way from the African Forum and Network on Debt and Development, AfroDad. I always have to look AfroDad. I always have to look, African Forum and Network on Debt and Development. I'm so used to AfroDad, that I have to go back. So Thando, obviously over there, is Policy and Advocacy Officer for Sovereign Debt Management. And of course, as you heard in the introduction, he has served in other portfolios. And today, that is what we were simply interrogating. And I'm sure that from this conversation, a lot of policymakers, a lot of people that are in this particular space will be able to get some valuable insights that will be key to making sure that we make progress when it comes to even achieving the balance that we talked about in this particular conversation, when it comes to harnessing the economic dividends of fossil fuels, at the same time protecting the environment. And that is what we're focusing on today. So before I let you go, you can still win yourself those amazing goodies, hoodies, t-shirts, mug cups, capes, all kinds of things. All you simply have to do is be interactive on our social media platforms where the episodes of the People Space podcast broadcast. That is Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and all these other platforms. On Facebook and YouTube, it is the handle, the Center for Trade Policy and Development. And on these other platforms, TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, it is CTPD Zambia. So if your comment garners enough tractions or reactions or triggers conversations, you are that candidate that may receive that call for these fantastic prizes. So let's keep being interactive, let's keep talking, and most importantly, hit that like button. See you next time.